on, golf fans? It's your boy Gsluke here with perhaps a surprise video, but we've got ourselves the LIV Golf Boston event this week, and with the International hosting it, the Oaks course, there's actually been quite a bit of coverage of it this week. So a little bit of a change from some of the media coverage we've had at these LIV events over the last few months. But this week, you have a pretty good idea of what to expect. A few YouTubers out there that have played the course over the last week or so, but more importantly, from the media itself, we're starting to get more reports from the grounds. I think the fact that it is a US-based event helps that, with so much of the golf media, particularly for the US side, based here in the US like you'd expect. We just have a much better idea of the actual playing conditions and, rough lengths, the strain of grass out there, and more importantly, the actual setup of the golf course this time, where we're not guessing going in. So I'm excited to hop into it. We'll be covering both from a betting and a fantasy side. So for Draftkings, you do have that round 1, round 2, and round 3 showdown. And then for the betting side, you can bet outright like you would for any other tournament. We're going to go over key stats, comp courses that'll give you an idea of the sort of players you might want to target here for the first LIV event in Boston. So I'm looking forward to it. Again, for us golf junkies, pretty much anything we can get at this point is going to be solid. I mean, DP World Tour, I have some exposure there this week, but a majority of it will be here on the LIV side, where at least personally, I have a lot more knowledge about the player base. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hop on in. All right, so the International Oaks course, it's just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. It is a Tom Fazio design that typically plays as a par 72, but one that has 5 par 5s and 5 par 3s. So a very atypical par 72 setup is going to be playing as a par 70 this week. So you'll still have 5 par 3s, only 3 par 5s with the professional tournament setup. So you would expect it to be a relatively difficult golf course, but that cannot be further from the truth. Even with a few of those par 5s turned into par 4s, which are going to play closer to 500 yards, I expect this place to absolutely be eaten apart. I mean, I think this is by far the easiest LIV track we are going to have seen so far, and really it's something that they need to have happen. They've played a lot of difficult tracks. The scoring hasn't really reflected the quality of player over there at LIV, and now that they can get on a course where I expect the scoring average to probably be like 2 or 3 shots under par, you're going to be looking at absolute fireworks. So expect to see a lot of low numbers, perhaps people that get close to shooting something like a 62, 63 pretty much every single round. So despite it being a par 72, the par 5s are all extremely gettable. So the 3 that will remain are still going to be under 570 yards. One of them's closer to 520, one's close to 530. So it's going to be a driver, maybe a 4 or 5 iron at most into that sort of green. The par 3s are all short too. You have one that's like 130 yards, a few that are right around 150, 170 yards as well. So all of them are going to be birdie looks. A few drivable par 4s. So one of them that's 370, one that's close to 400 yards that also plays downhill. So when we go hole by hole, we'll talk about some of these key holes. But even with, it being a par 70 rather than a 72, you're going to see extremely low scores. If they played it as a par 72, I mean, you're going to see scores that are just outlandishly easy, because this course is a resort style golf course. And let's talk about really what we mean there. So first off, the scorecard yardage, it's going to play longer than this week. They are adding distance where they can, but there's only so much distance they can add. It's typically only 6,926 yards. So that's where the members play it for a par 72. Remember how short that is for a par 72. It's going to play closer to probably 7,200 yards. I imagine they'll probably find 20, 30 yards of distance on every single tee box to maybe add to that, but it's not going to be over 7,200 yards for par 70, which is still well on the shorter end of the spectrum when it comes to a tour course. The greens are large. They're right around 6,500 square foot, and they're running at, I'd say 12s right now, but they're going to run right around 11.5 to 12. If they add some moisture to them, I imagine they can probably slow them down a little bit, but they're bent grass, they're pure, they're running like you'd expect a high-end resort-style course to run. That doesn't get a ton of play because it's private. You can only play there, I believe, if you're a member or somebody that's a guest of a member, so you're looking at just pristine greens. They've kept people off of the side of the greens they're using for this event. So even for some of the YouTuber content, they've had, really tucked pin locations to keep them off of the main part of the green, right? You're only hitting it over there if it's a complete mishit. I expect it to be pure out there, and they're extremely receptive. So that's something I've noticed on some of the content that's been out there, is that pretty much no matter your ball flight, it's hitting once and spinning back. You're looking at absolute darts out there. And I mean, even with something like a 4 or 5 iron, sure, you're going to get release at that point, but it wasn't like balls were hitting the front of the green and going over the back. These are still tour speed greens. Because they're so receptive, you had players that were hitting it 4 or 5 irons to like 10 feet on 5 irons. And you're talking about players that aren't even professionals, right? They're just like scratch level golfers that were making near albatrosses on this golf course. So it's definitely receptive out there. With a wedge, you're going to see a lot of action on the green. The fairways are wide, right around 30 to 35 yards wide. They're also extremely generous and receptive too. So you're going to see a very high fairway percentage. In terms of the grass, it is bent grass, so you're dealing with bent grass fairways, which is, again, something you'd expect up here in Boston. It's what we see at pretty much all of these northeastern golf courses. And the rough is 2 to 3 inch bluegrass, and there are patches of fescue. Now, the fescue isn't all that common. It's usually about 30 to 40 yards offline, so to get into some of that native grass, you're really going to have to hit a bad shot, but that's also characteristic of a northeastern golf course, right? I mean, if you're going to miss into one of those native areas, you're going to feel it. But outside of that, 2 to 3 inch bluegrass isn't that much to worry about. So while it can be penal if it gets wet out there, it's been relatively dry in the Northeast for the last few weeks, so I don't expect it to play all that difficult. In general, you do have an extremely tree-lined golf course, though, and I think that's something that you'll see when we go hole by hole. It's a key characteristic. I think the only defense of this golf course has, because 7,200 yards at max, that's nothing. Again, you have 3 par 5s, and that's still at a par 70, so you still have 3 par 5s. They're all going to be gettable. All 5 par 3s are birdie holes, and then 2 drivable par 4s. I mean, this place is going to get absolutely taken apart if not for this one defense, and it is the tree-lined fairways, where they are unbelievably dense. So because of this is its own property, private sort of establishment, they have a lot of trees out there, and it's extremely dense. If you end up hitting it into the wooded areas, you get it in there 5 to 10 yards, you're pitching out sideways. You're going to have absolutely no shot at getting it to the green. They're dense. They're really thick trunks. You can tell they've been there for quite some time. That's why I say it matters that it's a private establishment. It's been there for a while. Is you can tell, like, the natural landscape there it's I don't want to say it's as remote as it gets, because it's not in a really remote area, but you'd think that it was based on some of the foliage that they have there. So it's going to be difficult to get out of. You don't want to miss too wildly off the tee, but again, these guys that aren't even scratch level golfers, maybe they're close to it, are going out there and they weren't hitting it in the trees at all. They did it like once or twice. They were playing a scramble, so they got away with it. So maybe some of the inaccurate drivers once or twice around end up getting into that sort of trouble. It's not going to completely derail you, though, right? That might end up being a 1-stroke penalty. You chip out sideways, get back in position, make your bogey, and move on. That's just going to be the outcome there, right? People aren't going to go for that hero shot. And sure, you might have a few lost balls that really derail somebody's round, but that's the only defense you have here. So the main thing I'm looking at, and again, we're going to talk about the key stats later, especially after we go hole by hole, is first off, guys that can stay out of that trouble, but more importantly, just guys that can hit their wedges, right? Because all you have to do is avoid that trouble and then go in there and score from fairway in. And you're going to be looking at wedges for pretty much almost, I would say every player in the field is going to have at least, let's say, 13 to 14 wedges in hand in terms of their round. And a few of them might be forced layups because you're hitting out of the trees, that sort of thing. But the players that can score with that 100 to 125 yard range, also that 125 to 150 yard range, are going to be at a massive advantage this week. So I think I can give you a better idea when we take this down hole by hole. So let's go ahead and do so. Alrighty, guys, this hole by hole breakdown should be even more helpful this week than per usual, because we've literally never seen this golf course before. But here in the first hole, you get a good idea of what to expect for pretty much your entire round. So if we go ahead and zoom in on this tee shot, you'll see that you have that tree-lined fairway aspect I was talking about. This is a par 5 for the members. I imagine they're probably going to play this as a par 4 for the players. So you can see it's 535 yards. It would not surprise me if this ends up being a par 4 to start and they end up shortening it, actually taking some distance off here. Perhaps have players make their target down here a little bit further, where first off, the trees come a little bit more into play. You also have to hit over this cart path area right here, which, if they move the tee box up, shouldn't be an issue. And it makes it a little bit more difficult because the landing area is nowhere near as large as the first landing area, which, this is what I meant by it gives you a good idea here. You can see it's still tree lined, but they have nearly 40 yards, I'd say almost 50 yards of room to land a drive here and play. And still have, maybe not the best angle into the green because you can see those trees, and they're really tall trees here, by the way. They're not only dense, but they're also really tall. You're going to have to hit a sweeping shot around that there. So though, as a par 5, it'd be relatively difficult, I do think that this might end up being a par 4 and that they end up using this fairway a little bit further up that's a lot more narrow as the actual landing area. So we'll have to see. I don't know, maybe someone ends up laying up back here. Let's see, what would that even look like? So if someone laid up here, they'd have 210 yards in, right? Like, it doesn't make sense, right? If they're going to move up the tee boxes, I think you're going to see players try to hit the ball up a little bit closer to the green, which leaves you 160 yards, right? So we'll have to see what the setup ends up being. We don't have the exact holes that have been changed to a par 5, from a par 5 to a par 4, but I imagine that hole number 1 is one of the most likely for that to happen. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on. Next up, we've got hole number 2. It's 175 yards, which, believe it or not, is on the longer side for the par 3s here. You can see the green is actually a little bit smaller. So the par 3 greens, a little bit smaller than what you're going to see for some of the par 4 and par 5 greens, which tend to be on the larger side of things. But anytime you have a hole that's less than 175 or right around that range and in, for these PGA Tour players, they're going to take it apart, right? And this one only has one bunker to speak of. I guess you do have to protect against going long because there's only right around 5 to maybe 10 yards of most of room right there from the back edge of the green to that wooded area, which, like I mentioned, it's so dense around this place that you never know if you're going to be completely stymied next to or behind a tree. Just, you don't want to open up that sort of variance. So I could see a lot of players perhaps taking a target towards the front of the green, just making sure that they don't open all of that variance. So maybe it plays a little bit more difficult than I expect, but it's extremely short. I think they're going to take it apart. The next hole is 345. This is going to be drivable for a lot of the field. Now, it plays slightly downhill. That's not the main reason I expect it to be drivable, but it also plays downwind. So in some of the media packages that have gone out, they've pointed out that hole number 3 typically plays downwind. Not always, but typically plays downwind. And because it's super firm out here this sort of year, again, end of August, end of summer, pretty much no matter what in the United States, you're going to have some pretty crunchy conditions. At the very least, players are going to get the ball probably close down to, flip wedge range, right around 300 yards. If not, and that's taking a 3-wood probably. Hitting it there, the 300 yards. Anyone that hits a driver is at the very least getting into this bunker. Is at the very least probably getting it onto the green, if not over the green here on the left side because of the lack of bunkering. And pretty much, if you're back here in the back left, which I expect a lot of people to miss back here, you have access to the entire green, right? I mean, maybe the one hard pin location would be a back left pin location because I imagine a lot of the slope goes from back to front, like 99% of greens do here on tour. But if it's a front left, you have plenty of room to get to that. Back right, same sort of thing. You have a lot of room to get there. Might miss a little bit low, right, because of some of the slope there, but that's okay. You can probably still make that putt. In a front right, you have pretty much all the access in the world to, and that's 353. I know that's a relatively long drive, right? But yeah, that's worst case scenario, right? If you only hit it like 320 yards, like most of the players will, you're going to be on the green or be right on that front edge and have access to every single pin, right? Including, that back left pin that might have been an issue before there. So this is going to be an eagle hole for a lot of players, but at the very least a birdie hole for, I think, at least 50% of the field. This is going to be like one of the holes that you absolutely have to take advantage of. The next hole I pretty much categorized the same way. This is the longest tee box they could possibly use. Same thing for hole number 2. That was 175 yards. So don't be surprised if they even move up to one of the further up tee locations for one of the holes because it's really all they've got. There's not really any distance they can add to this hole, and it's only 171 yards, and it's actually a little bit larger in terms of the green complex, a little bit more bunkering, but also it doesn't have those trees right over the back of the green, so it's a little bit more typical. Players will be able to be a little bit more aggressive into hole number 4 without having to worry about just nuking balls into the trees over the back, but again, expect a lot of birdie looks. Hole 5 is another drivable par 4 again. In the first 5 holes, we have 2 holes that are going to be, at the very least, sniffable by a lot of the field. Right now, they have it set up for just an iron 260 yards. We know that all of these tour players have a lot bigger aspirations than hitting a driving iron on a 340-yard hole. Expect them to, at the very least, get it into flip wedge range, much like the last hole that we talked about that was drivable, just 300 yards, so hitting a 3-wood most likely with the rollout is going to get you to a 40-yard pitch. Most people are going to, at very least, drive it into the greenside bunker, if not get it up here to the right with a perfect little chip into every single pin location. So much like the first drivable par 4, you're pretty much at the very least looking to birdie that hole. Next up, we've got 393. So it's, again, another short hole out here. A lot of players may actually take driving iron here. Just try and take this fairway bunker out of play. Again, 120-yard shot out of a bunker is not one of the easier shots to execute, regardless of your skill level. I mean, even for these tour professionals. But if you want to get a little aggressive about it, like a Bryson DeChambeau undoubtedly will do, he's going to have like 60 yards in. He's going to hit it up there in the fairway if he executes his tee shot and have something like a little flip 58 degree in, little like half 58 degree for Bryson. So it's going to be an interesting golf course. I think it could be absolutely annihilated by these tour pros. Next up, they've got hole number 7. It is 418 yards. In fact, this is what we'd classify as a quote-unquote difficult hole. Again, if hole number 1 is taken from a par 5 to a par 4, it's probably going to play right around like 450 yards. That would be maybe the most difficult hole that we've seen so far. This would be another one, but look at this fairway. It literally looks like an aircraft carrier. Like, if we zoom out, like, I don't mean to joke around this golf course too much. Like, I think it's just going to be an absolute cupcake. It literally looks like an aircraft carrier out there. Like, if you were in a helicopter over the sea and you just saw an aircraft carrier, that's exactly what it would look like. You're going to have a really hard time missing this fairway. So you can say they have it at 280 yards. That's where it's its largest. It's pretty much impossible to miss that. It's at least 50 yards wide. You can see it looks a lot thinner down there, but that's still like a 30-yard wide fairway. It's just because of how large the other landing area is. So if you want to get aggressive about it, hit driver, that sort of thing, you're not going to have that much trouble. And again, you are rewarded with a sub 100-yard wedge shot. Again, a field wedge shot, which for a lot of these players is absolute money, and they're looking at maybe at the very most 5 to 10 feet per birdie. Hole 8 should remain as a par 5 because it is 546 yards. Believe it is the second longest par 5 on property, and it's one that everyone should be able to reach into. So they have this drive set at 280. I don't know if they're just setting this up for like people that don't play professional golf. I guess it makes sense, right? This is the first time they've played pro golf here. Get it out there 310 yards. You're left with, let's see, if we set our second target here, just to make sure that we're getting like the actual true yardage, let's see what we've got. It's 214 yards. So, you hit it 310 off the tee, you're left with 214. That's probably something like a 6, maybe a 7 iron for some of these players into the green, maybe a 9 iron for somebody like a Bryson DeChambeau or a Matthew Wolff. This is going to be yet another eagle hole. So, again, through the first 8 holes, we have 2 drivable par 4s. We have this hole, which should be almost a gimme birdie as well. So that's 3 birdies right there, right? So remember this for prize picks, also for Draftkings Showdown. The longer players, right, are looking at 3 almost gimme birdies through the first 8 holes. And then you have all those holes where you're going to have like 60 to 80 yards in at the very most. I mean, just there's no way that these players don't absolutely just destroy this place, like in at least through the first 8 holes, right? Hole 9 is, again, one of the quote-unquote difficult holes, and it's 453 yards. There's not really any distance they can add here either. You can see the trees are right behind the last tee box there. Another aircraft carrier fairway, particularly if you hit something like a 3-wood or something like a driving iron off the tee. If you hit a driver, you can see it thins out a little bit. I think that's something that Fazio is known for. At least, I'm not an expert on Fazio designs. He's not somebody that, really studying as an architect. But it's something that I've noticed at a lot of his golf courses is the more aggressive that you are off the tee, the more accurate, more precise that you have to be. So you definitely see that on this hole, but I don't think you have to push it down there, right? If you hit a driving iron off the tee, you still only have 175 yards into one of the larger greens on property, which you can see is oval shaped. It doesn't have that much contouring to it. Only the one greenside bunker to worry about, which unless it's a middle right pin or a front right pin, probably isn't going to matter all that much. It's a difficult hole on a golf course that's just pretty much a cupcake. In terms of the back nine, you do have another 450-yard par 4, so you're looking at least a longer golf hole, right? At least it's not a cupcake, right around 340 yards. But yet again, a huge landing area. I mean, even if you hit driver off this tee, you're still going to have a pretty solid surface to get the ball to stop on. And then another large green that only has one greenside bunker that, yet again, I expect these players to absolutely annihilate. You have the longest par 3 on property. It is 209 yards. This is tipped out, so, a few of the other tee boxes may be able to add 5 to 10 yards to it, but, much like a few tee boxes ago, the trees are right behind here, so there's not much room to be added, but you do have a very large surface. So if there's going to be a par 3 that plays over par, or really any hole at all on this entire golf course that plays over par, it might end up being the par 3 11th, but it's not going to trip up too many players, right? They can hit a 200-yard approach shot, get it on one, 2-putt, get out of there with par all day. Next up, we've got ourselves a par 5. Now, this one's kind of iffy. Now, if they use one of these tee boxes up here, you can see like these two where there's like maybe a 50, 60-yard difference. They can have this play as like a 470, 480-yard hole. The more aggressive you try to cut this corner here, set up approaches in that 160 to 170-yard range. So I could see them using this as a par 4. I'm not sure on their intentions. We'll have to see here for Friday's round. If they play it as a par 5, it'll be reachable by 2. If they play it as a par 4, might be the second, maybe third most difficult golf hole on the entire property, but you do have a relatively large green here, so when you get it up there, you should be all right. It is protected in the front by bunkers, which does add a little bit of difficulty. Over the back, you also have some trees, which again just adds another hazard to worry about. So it'll be interesting. I think it has enough teeth to keep it as a par 5, which is part of the reason why I'm not sure what they're going to do with it here. But you also have 18, which I believe is also a par 5, and part of me makes me think that they want to make that like a par 5 finishing hole. A lot of, excitement there. You've seen that at a few of the LIV golf courses so far. They've kept the par 5 18th as the par 5 18th and put a lot of build out on it because you see a lot of birdies, eagles, a lot of movement at that hole. So I don't know. I'll have to see what they do with hole 12. Might end up being a difficult par 4. I'm kind of shading that direction right now. Hole 13 is 158 yards. This is a cupcake of a par 3. This is on the shorter end of the spectrum that I was talking about before. Pretty much any pin location that they use, you're going to be hitting the ball to 10, 15 feet all day. So I expect to see a ton of birdies there. Hole 14 is definitely going to be converted to a par 4. So I don't want to say like the more I think about it, right? Like 18 is probably going to be a par 5. Like I pretty much locked that in, right? Because of all the build out, what you've seen at other LIV golf courses. The last one definitely has some teeth to it. This, like there's no teeth to it at all. Like if they keep this as a par 5, it's going to be annihilated. They also have a few tee boxes that it would make sense to use up there. So in terms of the one on the back nine, I think there's going to be a par 5. It's probably, par 4. It's probably this one. The bunkering up here wouldn't matter at all. So that kind of takes that out of play. Yeah, this is probably the hole they're using as a par 4. So just again, it's just all speculation at this point. But based on the difficulty of what we're looking at here, this is more than likely going to be converted to a par 4. Play on the longer end of the spectrum. So even if they move up the tee box, let's see what it would look like. So let's move our set tee position to maybe up here. It's a 484-yard hole. So it's going to play pretty difficult. Your first target, let's move that up here too. Give it a more accurate drive here. Let's 280 here to hit a 3-wood. Players are probably going to hit driver because it does taper off there a little bit. And leave themselves with 160 yards. Yeah, this makes perfect sense as a par 4, so I could see that. On the last hole, right, going back to the last par 5, just to give you an idea, right, a couple holes. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong direction there. Hole 12 is what we're looking at. There's like a lot of hazards here, right? You have the 2 greenside bunkers, so let's go ahead and look at that. And then you have the trees over the green. That's really going to actually be frightening. I mean, you can have lost balls in there, have to chip out sideways, take it unplayable. These bunkers, of course, on a par 5, you'd rather not be in those to begin with. But I mean, they're not a massive hazard, but you might blade it over that into the trees, right? I mean, that's a possibility there. I like them using this as a par 5 a lot more than this really straightforward one that we had. Okay, I'm going the wrong direction again. The really straightforward one that we have here, that's what, like 500 yards? Yeah, 480 yards if they end up using it as a par 4. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. So that's what I expect them to do there. Hole 15 is 427 yards. It's relatively straightforward. I do expect most players to lay up here because there is a ton of bunkering, which I'm sure is going to be visually pleasing, but from a strategy perspective, It would be far too risky to try and force it down there. So a lot of players probably taking iron off the tee. Again, only 147 yards, so still a wedge into the green. Hole 16 is 440, a dogleg from right to left. I expect most players to try and take it over the corner here, so the target's only set at 255 yards. I'm not buying that. I'm expecting most guys to try and bite off quite a bit here, hit it probably 300 yards with their driver, which is going to leave another pitching wedge in. So just, hit it in the fairway there. You're looking at another birdie look. Hole 17 is 192 yards, a massive green surface. Just another birdie hole. Anytime you give these players 200 yards or less into a par 3, they're going to take advantage, particularly when the greens are as flat as what we have around the International here, and also running as pure as what we're expecting. And this is hole 18 that I was talking about. I mean, they've got to keep this as a par 5. I don't see them turning this one into a par 4. If they do, it'll be a really difficult hole. But if as a par 5, it's reachable by the entire field, you can see it's right around 250 yards for your second shot in, maybe even less for some of the bombers. If you decide to lay up, you're left with a 70-yard wedge shot into a relatively large green 2. Just definitely a birdie hole for the entire field, and a hole that I expect to have quite a bit of fireworks on it. Now, the reason why I say that this should be also a par 5 is all this room over here in the bunker. I expect this to probably be built out. So then to put bleachers there in that area, there's not really room over there on the left because of all the trees there. And they love to do that on LIV. Like, they put their Club 54 on the 18th hole. I think it's been there for every single event so far, and I expect that to be the same here for the LIV Boston event. All right, now that we've seen the golf course, let's talk about the stats that I'll be using to identify my top plays. So at number 1, we have shots gained approach. So we talked about the emphasis on short iron play, also wedge play, so that 100 to 125 yard range, that 125 to 150 yard range, and really even that 50 to 125 yard range, which you saw really common on the par 5s for laying up, or even for some of those drivable par 4s. If you decide to maybe be a little bit more cautious about it, you're going to have a lot of those feel wedges too. So I'm hunkering down on those 3 ranges specifically, but also that long iron range. So that 200 plus yard iron range, so 200 to 225, also 225 to 250. I'm going to look at a little bit extra too. So those mid irons may be a little bit neglected in my modeling, and it's because, most of the holes here are those long par 5s that you're taking advantage of with those longer clubs, or just extremely short holes that you're going to have 9 iron at the very most into. So I really want to focus my analysis on the 2 ends of the spectrum, the short and the long range, and the mid irons are being a little bit left out. Next up, we've got shots gained putting on bent grass. So we have pure bent grass greens here, so taking a look at that. And because the ball striking test isn't all that difficult, I could see this turning into a quote-unquote effing birdie fest, as somebody like John Rahm would say, right? When anytime the greens are easy to hit, you have relatively wide fairways. Sometimes the ball strikers don't get rewarded as much as they necessarily do week to week. And at these events, putting becomes the name of the game. So definitely something that I'm looking at a lot more this week than for most weeks. And at number 3, we have shots gained off the tee. With the drivable par 4s, with some of the par 5s that are going to be absolute cupcake holes if you get it there off the tee, and just the par 4s in general, where if you're hitting the fairway with your driver, you're going to have 120 yards lesser in, sometimes 80 yards lesser into the green. You can almost dissect this golf course with your driver alone, right? And just be mediocre with the irons, make a few putts on the day, shoot something like 6 to 7 under par. So those are the top 3 key stats I'm looking at. Shots gained approach, shots gained putting on bent, and then shots gained off the tee. And we're looking at both accuracy and power. I guess I should add that to the shots gained off the tee number there, because you do have those tree-lined fairways. The one defense that I did give this golf course, and that we gave it credit to pretty much the entire time, were those fairways, right? And they taper off a little bit. They get a little bit more narrow the closer that you get to the hole. You definitely don't want to ignore that, but you still have at least 40 to 50 yards of room, right? It's not like you're dealing with 20, 30 yard wide narrow chutes like you have there at a Sedgefield Country Club for the Wyndham Championship, or even what you have for Harbour Town, where literally you do have 25 yards between the 2 tree lines for the left and the right side. You have almost twice as much room here. So it reminds me a lot more of a Caves Valley golf course than it does a Sedgefield or a Harbour Town golf links, like we play a lot of times on the PGA Tour. So off the tee, power definitely a part of the game, but accuracy definitely helpful. So it's still up there as well. The other key stats I'm looking at are birdie or better percentage. I expect this to be an absolute birdie fest, so definitely want the guys that make a lot of birdies. Par 3 scoring, so with the 5 par 3s, definitely a little bit more important this week. Good drive percentage, so the amount of times that players are able to hit a green after their drive. So essentially, like even if they're in the rough, how bad was that drive? Were they still given access to the green? So good drive percentage, I like quite a bit. Looking at GAR percentage and also 3-putt avoidance, we do have relatively large greens here, so I do think that you might see a few more 3-putts this week than you might be used to seeing on the tour. And now lastly, we've got our comp courses. At number 1, we've got ourselves TPC Potomac, the home of the Wells Fargo Championship. And while I don't think it's a perfect comp, it's a northeastern golf course. It was over there in Maryland, had bent grass greens, bent grass fairways, also that bluegrass rough with patches of fescue. From an agronomical perspective, a lot of parallels that can be made. And from the scoring perspective, it was also relatively gettable out there. Now, the defense of the Wells Fargo was the weather, of course. There was drenching rain there on Saturday, also quite through a lot of the round there on Sunday as well, which changed a lot of the scoring, right? Made it a little bit more difficult anytime you're playing through a drenching rain. But in terms of the skill set for success, there should be quite a bit of crossover between the two venues. So I'm looking at some of the guys that played well there to maybe try and get the same type of build with some of the LIV guys I'm looking at this week. And next up, we've got TBC River Highlands, the home of the Travelers Championship, which if Bubba Watson was playing, oh boy, it would be all over Bubba Watson here, but still dealing with the meniscus tear. So hopefully he can get back out here as soon as humanly possible. But I love the golf course. First off, agronomically, just like the Wells Fargo Championship, very similar golf course there, but also a little bit shorter, right? A lot of fairways hit there, large landing areas, also tree lined, but you'll have plenty of room around TPC River Highlands, and also greens that are hit well above the tour average, despite not being the most massive greens. And I think a lot of that is due to how receptive they are. And based on all of the things that I've seen, especially a lot of the video content on this golf course over the last few days, it looks unbelievably receptive. So I expect to see similar type of effect at this golf course, which makes that a comp that I'm using quite a bit. And lastly, Brookline Country Club. So home of the US Open this year. So we don't have a massive sample size, but another northeastern golf course up there in Massachusetts. You have these bent grass greens, bent grass fairways. The bluegrass rough is all the same, at all three of these golf courses. Also relatively short par 70. TPC River Highlands, I believe it's a 71, but it's still really short. Potomac was, I believe, maybe a par 71, but it was on the shorter end. Brookline, I believe, was also maybe a par 70 or 71. Either way, shorter end of the spectrum, same type of agronomics out there. And though it's definitely a lot more difficult, a lot more difficult than Potomac or River Highlands too, for that matter, you still get a similar setup, similar driving accuracy issues off the tee. You hit into those trees, you'll be chipping out sideways from time to time at Brookline. A lot of parallels that can be made. So for anybody that's had success at any three of these courses, sure, they get a little bit of an extra boost. But I know a lot of them haven't played there before, right? So how do we use this? You look at who's played well at these three events to get an idea of the types of players that succeed. And just to give you an idea, right? Wells Fargo Championship, it was all about guys that were solid with those wedge ranges on approach. It was all about hitting the fairway, so driving accuracy was definitely really important at the Wells Fargo too. So definitely something that I might be considering a little bit more this week than most. That's why it was shots gained off the tee, not just driving distance. Obviously taking advantage of those par 5s and those drivable par 4s matters, but also, at the Wells Fargo, you saw just how important it was getting it in the fairway, being able to hit those wedges to 5 to 10 feet, having control of your spin. I mean, that's the real key of being in the fairway, is being able to apply the proper amount of spin to the golf ball. So, at the Wells Fargo, it showed us to take those precise guys. The guys are more accurate, right? So maybe that's something to take a look at. At TPC River Highlands, you've seen a lot of diversity in the players that have had success there, but most notably, guys that are good on bent grass with their putting and that are just good approach players in general. I mean, Bubba Watson, right? Multiple time winner there. This year, you had guys like Cantley, Xander Schauffele up there in contention that both played extremely well. And over the last few years, it's really been that same sort of thing. I mean, even Harris English, right? Pretty damn good approach player with those shorter wedge ranges. So that's something I'm looking at there. And lastly, with Brookline, I mean, it's hard to say because it was a major championship, because just frankly, the best players in the world played well there. But in general, we were looking at guys that were accurate off the tee around Brookline. It was a little bit tighter off the tee, so I guess that makes quite a bit of sense. But also that bent grass putting reared its head there. You know, anytime you have one of these shorter tracks, that usually is the case. And also shots gained around the green. So maybe that was just because it was a major championship, but something that I'm at the very least keeping on the back burner as something that I potentially weigh, at the very least, average this week, right? I'm not going to completely avoid it because it has reared its ugly head at one of these comp courses before. Alrighty, boys, that is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Going to be doing a live stream tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern time, talking about everything to know about round 1 showdown. Going to go through the player poll, some weather, talk a little bit more about the golf course, and also go over your live chat. So any questions you have, there'll be literally anything you want to know available there. We'll bring up my projections. We'll make a few lineups together. And of course, if you have any specific questions, it's your show too, right? We can take it in any direction that you'd like. We can talk strategy, players. We can talk outright bets there too. There's a few I've already placed that we'll talk about here in the live stream. Just looking forward to it. So look for a link in the description of the video to that. Also, we've got our football Patreon starting. So that started today, and content dropping for the season starting in just a few days here. We'll have our preview for the opening day match going on. Also, for the main slate, we'll have a few pieces of content dropping throughout next week. And then, of course, all my projections on Patreon too. I do projections for all of those slates, ownership projections too, and it's ever a hoot. We had a lot of fun with it last year, a lot of success on our end as well, and looking forward to yet another successful go at it here for the 2022-2023 season. So looking forward to everything there. Best of luck with all of your lineups. Or if you're playing this week, all of your outright bets, if you're going that direction here for the LIV Golf event, make sure you smash that like button before you hop on out of here. And also, go ahead and comment down below what you think the winning score is going to be this week. I think it's going to be an absolute smash fest. Remember, it's only 3 rounds, right? So incorporate that there. But I think the winning score from the individual perspective might be something like 20 under par. Like legitimately, I think it's going to be that low. And from the team perspective, might be like 75 under par. But go ahead and let me know what you guys are thinking down below, and I'll catch you guys for the live stream later.